The city of Detroit was booming in the olden days, but when the crack epidemic came into effect, the cities with the most hard-working people across the entire America felt the effect of the crack epidemic the most. And from that came the hustlers who saw an opportunity to make fast money. Kids growing up no longer wanted to follow the positive role models. They instead looked to the rich illicit kingpins as their role models. Today we go into the stories of the most dangerous drug kingpins in Detroit's history. Number 5. Demetrius Holloway. Demetrius Holloway was born in 1958 on the east side of Detroit, Michigan, and grew up in the Brewster Douglas projects. His mother was a mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. Known as a meticulous dresser even in his youth, Holloway is said to have worn suits to high school. Holloway, a childhood friend of then-future drug kingpin Richard Maserati Rick Carter, also developed close ties to Big Frank Nitty Usher and James Red Freeman in his late teens. Both Usher and Freeman were members of Murder Row, a street gang prominent in the late 1970s, whose primary source of income was importing H from Amsterdam to Detroit. In 1979, Holloway held a job as a postal clerk for a brief stint on Detroit's east side. That same year, he received a federal conviction for interstate transportation of stolen goods, for which he served a 5-year prison sentence in Chicago, Illinois. 6 months after his release in 1985, Holloway got a job managing at a pool hall. Around this time, Holloway formed a partnership with lifelong friend Carter, who had by this time established himself as a successful narcotics trafficker. In 1986, Holloway used his share of the drug proceeds to purchase several acres of land in Alabama, open 3 sporting goods stores, and purchase apartment buildings in downtown Detroit that he managed through his company. Holloway and Carter began consolidating their power by aligning themselves with 16-year-old narcotics supplier Richard Whiteboy Rick Wershey. Initially, Carter, with his boxing background, was the enforcer for the organization, but the duo sought further protection as their business grew. They eventually incorporated the Best Friends gang, formerly the Wrecking Crew, into the organization for added muscle. The Best Friends consisted of 4 brothers. Aside from adding them to the payroll, Holloway and Carter provided the Brown brothers with assault weapons, bulletproof vests, and defense attorneys when legal aid was needed. Eventually, a rift developed between Holloway and the Browns when the former objected to Carter introducing the brothers to his Colombian supplier. Agents of the Detroit office of the DEA seized 2 of Holloway's sporting goods stores and a Mercedes-Benz from his mother as part of a federal investigation. On September 12, 1988, Carter was executed in his bed at a Detroit's hospital, where he was recuperating from gunshot wounds sustained in a shootout 2 days earlier. A couple days later, Holloway staged his own kidnapping. Witnesses reported hearing several gunshots prior to seeing a man, identified as Holloway, being thrown into the trunk of a car. After several months, Holloway returned to Detroit. Monday, October 8, 1990, while shopping at the Broadway clothing store, located in downtown Detroit, 2 blocks from Detroit Police Headquarters, Holloway was fatally shot twice in the back of the head. His body was found minutes after the shooting with the handgun and $17,000 cash he was carrying. In 1999, federal investigators alleged that Holloway's homicide 9 years earlier was carried out by hired gunmen. Number 4. Maserati Rick. Richard Earl Carter was born and raised in post-industrial Detroit, Michigan, following the decline of the city's auto industry. Carter joined a car theft ring as a teen and purchased his first car with the profits. Later down, after spending a year in prison, after he came out, lifelong friend Demetrius Holloway founded a narcotic trafficking organization and filled the vacuum left by Sylvester Seal Murray. Carter began selling H in 1983, and by 1985 he had made a significant name for himself in the Motor City. Carter and partner Holloway soon consolidated their power by making significant alliances. They ensured that the flow of narcotics would continue by aligning themselves with 16-year-old narcotics supplier Richard Whiteboy Rick Wershey, who was dating the wife of convicted narcotic kingpin Johnny Curry of the Curry Boys and niece of Detroit's then-mayor Coleman Young. Carter expanded his supply chain by securing ties on both the east and west coasts by way of Miami and Los Angeles. Federal investigators credit the organization with becoming the first narcotics ring to take over the I-75 corridor for use as a pipeline for transporting narcotics from Miami to Detroit. Carter laundered his earnings from narcotics through several small businesses, including hair salons, barbershops, and car washes. Reportedly, car washes served a dual role, as they not only provided a steady stream of cash which served to conceal his true income, but they also shielded large transactions. By 1987, Carter was the main drug supplier to the whole of the east side of Detroit. Carter and the best friends also managed to expand beyond Detroit to control other Michigan cities. Before reaching his 30th birthday, Carter had become a multi-millionaire. His net worth was estimated to have been in excess of $20 million. His rise to the top, however, did not come peacefully. Carter's organization was linked to over 100 homicides in the greater Detroit area. Around this time, lifelong friend and business partner Demetrius Holloway was rumored to have had an affair with the mother of Carter's child, Tracy Cowan. However, Carter's biggest rivalry during this time was with former childhood friend and business associate, Edward Big Ed Hansard. In all, Carter is said to have made 3 attempts on Big Ed's life. In one incident, the exchange of automatic gunfire resulted in Hansard being shot in the stomach and left to recuperate for months. When questioned by police, Hansard refused to name his attackers, instead declaring that he'd handle it himself. To escape police pressure, Big Ed temporarily relocated to Yazoo City, Mississippi. Big Ed's drug-running operation continued while he was away, and during an arrest for a weapons violation, he was quoted as telling the arresting officers, "I am going to get Maserati Rick, and then I'm going to get you." On September 10, 1988, a shootout ensued outside of one of Carter's car washes, which left Carter wounded in the stomach and Hansard and an associate shot in the arm. None of the participants cooperated with police investigators. 2 days later, while Carter was being treated for the injuries he sustained in the shooting, allegedly, one of Hansard's enforcers, Lodrick the Hitman Parker, entered his hospital room and took out Carter. Number 3. Edward Big Ed Hansard. Edward Hansard was born and raised on the east side of Detroit, Michigan. He grew up in the gang-infested part of northeast Detroit. With the turbulent times around the community, the then 5'6" Hansard made his first steps toward becoming a narcotics lord as a low-level marijuana dealer. While his marijuana business eventually provided him with a sizable income, he still hadn't attained the kind of success realized by 2 childhood associates, Maserati Rick Carter and Demetrius Holloway. In fact, Carter and Holloway and their best friend's drug network, who were higher up on the illegal drug food chain, were Hansard's initial suppliers. Eventually, Hansard's success and ambition led him to break away from the best friend's umbrella and built his narcotics network in the east side of Detroit. Hansard negotiated with notorious California crack kingpin Rick Ross for a steady supply of coke, which allowed him to step out from underneath the shadow of Maserati Rick Carter's organization. To conceal the true source of his earnings, he acquired hair salons and promoted a public image of a successful entrepreneur. At some point, Hansard and Maserati Rick Carter's relationship delegated into a professional and personal rivalry. The talk on the street was crazy, and one of the main things was that started the tension was because he had an outside connection in California, which was Rick Ross. In the summer of 1987, it progressed to a public face-to-face argument in the unisex hair salon, owned by Hansard, and eventually led to shootouts and assassination attempts between the two. As Hansard's business grew, he inevitably found himself both competing with his former associates and racking up arrests. To escape the danger and police pressure, he temporarily relocated to Mississippi. The frequent comings and goings of his associates with high-priced luxury and sports cars, as well as the armed guards patrolling the grounds, did garner unwarranted attention, with residents describing the home as a defended compound. In February of 1988, Hansard was detained by Louisiana State Police following a traffic stop in which he $198,000 in cash, which was seized. Another traffic stop in March resulted in the seizure of 31 kilos of coke from one of his associates. In addition to the seizures, Hansard was also arrested and charged with weapons violations on 3 separate occasions. In all, Maserati Rick is said to have made 3 attempts on Hansard's life, but the hostilities were very much mutual. Hansard reportedly participated in a drive-by of Maserati Rick mother's home while she was standing on the front porch holding his 2-year-old son. On September 10, 1988, a shootout occurred outside of one of Carter's car washes when Hansard and another man opened fire on him. Carter was left wounded in the stomach, and Hansard and his associate were both shot in the arm. None of the participants cooperated with police investigators. A couple days later, while Carter was being treated for the injuries he sustained in the shooting, one of Hansard's enforcers, Lodrick the hitman Parker, entered his hospital room. When Parker left the room, Carter was dead from gunshots to the face. Carter's assassination became the first time that there was a shooting inside the hospital in its 50-year history. Hansard was brought to trial when one of his associates began cooperating with federal prosecutors during their investigation against him for narcotics trafficking. Prosecutors estimated that Hansard had generated $54 million annually in narcotics sales at his peak. According to law enforcement, he was shot 9 times on 3 separate occasions. On May 9, 1991, he was sentenced to 30 years on conspiracy counts and 5 years each on firearms charges. He served his time and was released in 2016, but was pulled over in 2023 with $50,000 worth of narcotics. Number 2. Quasand Q Lewis. Quasand Danielle Lewis was born in 1972 in Michigan. In 1990, Lewis, who'd gotten the nickname Q, was arrested and convicted of possession with intent to distribute coke. Though he faced a potential 20 to 30 years, his attorney helped to secure him a 3-year sentence. Following his release, Lewis served an additional 4 months in prison after violating his probation. In 1997, Lewis and other members of his narcotics group traveled to Los Angeles, California to purchase coke. However, the funds Lewis intended to use to make payment, $484,000 in cash, were seized by police. In 2002, Lewis formed a partnership with the more flamboyant Tommy Lee Hodges because Hodges had tractor trailers and drivers in his employ. Hodges and Lewis's system involved transporting high quantities of marijuana, up to 3,000-pound loads, to Detroit from Arizona. Upon arrival, the marijuana would be delivered to warehouses and later shipped via box van to various distribution sites, including private homes, within an hour. Lewis eventually expanded from the Detroit area to California, Ohio, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Arizona, where he obtained marijuana wholesale. Hodges' business peaked in 2002 when he shipped an estimated 18,144 kilograms of marijuana to Detroit between January and October alone. He treated himself with the purchase of a yacht. Though profitable, the Lewis-Hodges partnership eventually devolved into a violent rivalry. In September of 2002, Lewis was shot as he was exiting a bar. On April 12, 2003, Lewis's chief enforcers at the time opened fire on Hodges, who was sitting in his Mercedes-Benz with girlfriend and a passenger outside of a Detroit nightclub. Hodges then emerged from the car and returned fire in the direction of the club. Following a search of the area, police retrieved 2 discarded handguns and a bulletproof vest. Police also found 2 semi-automatic rifles. 10 spent shell casings and magazines containing live rounds in the parking lot across the street. In July of 2003, Hodges' half-brother was killed in a drive-by shooting due to the violent rivalry with Lewis. DEA agents raided a Detroit home linked to Hodges on August 19th and seized 2 handguns, $26,120 in cash, a notebook containing information regarding marijuana sales, and soon after that, several handguns and $290,000 in cash was seized from Hodges' $1.1 million mansion in St. Clair Shores, Michigan by DEA agents. A Title III wiretap probe and the launch of a multi-agency investigation, dubbed Operation Falling Star, into the activities of what law enforcement referred to as the Lewis Organization. The investigation would ultimately span 16 months and involve 19 agencies, including the DEA, FBI, IRS, ICE, United States Attorney's Office, the United States Marshals Service, and various local police agencies, including the Detroit and Novi police departments. On July 15th, Lewis and other associates were surveilled from Michigan to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. After being dropped off, Lewis attempted to board a plane using an alias. He was arrested, extradited to Detroit, and incarcerated in Wayne County Jail. A federal grand jury indicted Lewis and 22 others with various federal narcotics trafficking and money laundering charges. Lewis himself was charged with operating a continuing criminal enterprise, which carries a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors estimated Lewis's organization's gross proceeds from marijuana alone to be more than $178 million annually. At his peak, Lewis supplied 50% of the marijuana that entered Detroit. Though he wasn't charged with any assassinations, federal investigators linked him to a more 50 homicides. Number 1. Big Meech. Demetrius Edward Flannery was born on June 21, 1968 in Cleveland, Ohio. He and his brother came of age during the 1980s, when their impoverished hometown was besieged by the ravages of the crack boom. Local headlines were dominated by the exploits of notorious local narcotic organizations, such as YBI and Pony Down. The evening news also gave extensive coverage to the lives and oftentimes deaths of homegrown street legends like Maserati Rick Carter, Butch Jones, and Ed Hansard. Demetrius and Terry reportedly began their criminal careers selling $50 bags of crack in the mid-1980s as teenagers. Demetrius, who was known as Meech around this time, dropped out of high school in the 10th grade at the age of 16 to devote his full attention to the narcotics business, and the brothers quickly progressed to selling 2 kilos worth of coke a week. Before the 1980s ended, Demetrius made his first trip to the city that would become his adopted home, Atlanta, Georgia. While not members themselves, the brothers developed strong ties to a Northwest Detroit gang called the PA Boys, named after their base, Puritan Avenue. The PA Boys, however, were under intense scrutiny by law enforcement throughout the 1980s and 90s. In 1988, Demetrius was sentenced to 2 years probation following a conviction for narcotics possession. In the mid-1990s, the brothers traveled to California seeking a direct connection to foreign suppliers, to cut out all of the middlemen so that they could keep more money for themselves, as well as to reduce the number of people with knowledge of their dealings. They were eventually introduced to Mexican cartel sources through a California narcotics trafficker. The brothers laundered their narcotics proceeds through a taxi service that Terry founded using the money that he was awarded by a settlement of a malpractice suit following a botched eye surgery. In 1994, Demetrius and a Colombian accomplice were arrested on narcotics charges, which were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence. By the mid-1990s, the brothers had expanded outside of Detroit and even Michigan. They began making inroads into other states, including Kentucky, Georgia, Missouri, Texas, and California. When the dominant coke traffickers in Atlanta, Georgia, the Miami Boys, were dissolved as a result of a string of federal convictions in the early 1990s. The two took advantage of the situation and quickly took steps to fill the vacuum. After negotiating with local distributors to become the new dominant suppliers in the area, Demetrius relocated to the city to oversee operations in the region. Despite being arrested numerous times beginning in his late teens, Demetrius avoided serving prison time throughout his long criminal career. Demetrius in Atlanta and Terry in Los Angeles. Reportedly, during this time, the Flannery's previously unnamed organization began to be called the Black Mafia family. BMF grew to over 500 members and operated in 11 states, including Georgia, California, Missouri, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, New York, Texas, Alabama, and Michigan. The organization dominated the narcotics trade in Atlanta and other cities largely due to the lower prices they offered to distributors. Because they obtained their coke wholesale directly from a Mexican cartel for $9,000 per kilo and thereby bypassed the usual middlemen costs, BMF was able to pass the savings on to street dealers at $17,000 per kilo. The Flannery's direct connection to Mexico also allowed for a purer product, estimated to be 90% pure. Investigators estimate that BMF was selling 600 kilos per month. After nearly 15 years of more or less staying under the radar of both the general public and law enforcement, Demetrius began to raise his public profile not long into the 21st century. Demetrius became a regular figure on the Atlanta, Georgia club scene and was usually accompanied by dozens of BMF members. The year 2003 would not only mark the beginning of BMF going public, it would also usher in the beginning of serious and permanent scrutiny by several law enforcement agencies. On October 28th, a law enforcement coalition comprised of the DEA, IRS, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Michigan formed an initiative named Operation Motor City Mafia, a task force solely devoted to bringing down BMF. Both Flannery brothers were apprehended in October. On October 20th, Demetrius was tracked and arrested in a rented $1.2 million mansion located in a suburb in Frisco, Texas, outside of Dallas. On October 27th, Terry was arrested alongside other BMF associates in a private home in a suburb outside of St. Louis, Missouri. Demetrius was granted $100,000 bond with the strict stipulation that he remain under house arrest. As the number of arrests of BMF members and associates mounted, it became clear just how wide the scope of the investigation against BMF was, and apparently just how large and widespread the organization itself was. According to an October 28, 2005 press release by the DEA, the investigation against BMF involved several law enforcement agencies. By late October, 47 BMF members and associates had been arrested, and 635 kilos of coke and $14 million in cash and assets linked to the organization had been seized. Most of the members of the uppermost levels of BMF went to trial in 2007. The federal indictment against BMF included 150 members of the organization. However, only Demetrius and Terry Flannery were charged under the statute, which can carry a life sentence. The U.S. government alleged that BMF generated revenue upwards of $270 million throughout its existence. On November 29, 2007, Demetrius pleaded guilty to leading a criminal enterprise before the United States District Court in Detroit. In September 2008, both Flannery brothers received 30-year sentences in federal prison for heading a narcotics trafficking organization under the CCE statute.